Montana Territory, summer of 1876, just outside the town of Twin Willows the first time he saw her. She was alone, barefoot, and carrying nothing but a broken satchel and a look like she had been chased straight out of hell. Elias Lark had seen a lot in his 32 years' war: drought, death riding in on a pale horse, but the look in that young woman's eyes still hit him like a bullet to the chest. He was on horseback, just coming down from the ridge trail with the last of his cattle when she stepped out of the tree line. Thin arms crossed tight over her chest like she was holding herself together with nothing but willpower. She was no more than 22, maybe 23. Dust clung to her skirt, her braid was coming loose, and her lip was cracked like she had not had water in days. "Ma'am," Elias reined in, voice low, careful not to spook her. "You lost." She blinked up at him, sun in her eyes, and shook her head. "No, I was told to leave, so I did." He dismounted slowly, boots crunching dry leaves. "You got a name, Rowena," she said. Her voice was raspy but steady. "Rowena Burke, Rowena Burke." The name settled in his mind like it had been waiting there. "You hurt?" he asked. She hesitated. Then with one glance back toward the trees, she said, "Only where folks cannot see." Elias did not ask more right then. He gave her his canteen, watched her drink like she had not tasted water in days, then nodded toward his horse. "You come with me. My land's just 2 miles west. You can rest there, nobody will bother you." She stared at him, wary. "You do not even know what I did." He looked her straight in the eye. "You did not deserve to be out here alone. That is enough for me." That was how it started. Elias lived out on the edge of the wilderness, 10 acres of hard Wyoming soil he had carved out with his own hands after the war. He had a lean-to barn, a one-room cabin, and a quiet, steady way about him. He was not the loud type. Most things he said were said with emotion, not words. Rowena stayed quiet the first few days. She helped him feed the animals, fetched water, and mended a torn sleeve on his only good shirt without being asked. She slept on the cot by the fire, curled up like she expected to be thrown out in the night. It was not until the 5th day that she told him. "I loved the wrong man," she said, her voice low as they shelled peas at the table. "He was a railroad surveyor, said he would marry me. Folks in my town did not like him. He was older, not from around there. When I would not give him up, they called me wicked. My father told me to leave his house or never speak again." Elias kept working the pods, not looking at her. "So you left." "He left me first. Soon as the survey ended, he was gone, but by then it was too late. Nobody wanted to hear that he had lied. They called me ruined, filthy. Said I brought shame on the whole town." She swallowed hard. "So I walked, thought maybe I would find work or somewhere new, but every place I passed through it was the same. They all look at a woman alone and think the worst." Elias finally looked up. "You did not do anything wrong." Rowena's eyes filled, but she blinked fast and looked away. Days passed. Then weeks. She never asked to stay, but she did not leave, and Elias never asked her to go. She learned to ride his second horse, Ember. She helped patch the roof after a storm. And one late August night, when the wind turned cold and Elias came in from fixing the fence with blood on his hand from a broken wire, she washed it clean and wrapped it in linen with gentle fingers. "You should not do this alone," she said, voice barely a whisper. He looked down at her hands on his. "I do not want to." Her eyes met his, wide and searching, but neither of them said anything else. A week later, trouble came. A man rode into Twin Willows asking after a woman with dark hair and a scar on her temple. Said she was a thief, a liar, and a whore. Said she had stolen something from him, his pride. The sheriff believed him. Rowena was dragged into town in chains, her wrists red and raw. Elias rode after them, rage burning through his veins like wildfire. "You will not touch her," he said, stepping between her and the sheriff. The sheriff spat. "You know her?" "I do," Elias said. "Then you know she is no good." "I know she is the best soul I have ever met." The man who had accused her, James Holloway, the railroad surveyor, tried to strike her. Elias caught his wrist mid-air. "You lay a hand on her," Elias said, his voice like thunder, "and you will not lift another." Rowena stood behind him, shaking, but when Elias turned to her, she was smiling through her tears. "You came for me," she whispered. He touched her cheek. "Of course I did. You believe me. I know you. That is all I need." It took 3 days for the truth to come out. Holloway had lied in 3 other towns, tried to have women arrested or worse. The sheriff finally let Rowena go, but not before saying she was no longer welcome in Twin Willows. They rode out together at dawn. Elias never looked back. "You still want to go somewhere new?" he asked as they rode. Rowena looked at him, eyes bright with something softer now. "Not if I am with you." He reached across the saddle and took her hand. "Then we will make our own place." Back at the cabin, Elias built a second room on the house. Rowena planted flowers in front of the porch. She cooked biscuits in the mornings and rode beside him at dusk. She laughed more now. She touched his arm when he passed, leaned into his side when the nights turned cold. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the pasture, Elias stood behind her close. "You still think you are ruined?" he asked. She turned to face him. "Not anymore." He cupped her face with both hands. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Rowena Burke." And when she kissed him, it was like something that had waited years to bloom finally found sun. That night, they held each other close beneath the stars, no more ghosts between them, and from then on, she was never alone again. The wind shifted in September. It whistled low through the cottonwoods and curled under the eaves of the cabin, carrying the scent of dry grass and turned earth. Elias had begun cutting firewood in the mornings, stacking the oak in neat cords beside the barn. Rowena mended a quilt by the window, her stitches steady, her brow furrowed in quiet concentration. She didn't hum. She never did. There was a stillness to her hands when they worked, focused, unhurried, as though each thread she pulled was something being set right. That afternoon, a rider came up from the south trail, dust thick on his coat and hat. Elias spotted him first and stepped outside with his axe still in hand. The rider dismounted slow, favoring his left leg, and tugged off his gloves with a wince. "I was told you've got shelter for a man down on his luck," he said, voice hoarse with road grit. Elias shifted his weight. "Depends what sort of luck chased you here." The man gave a tired half shrug. "Mine's the kind that runs out before you even know it's gone. Name's Tom Heller. Was cooking for a cattle drive out of Laramie. Got tossed when the trail boss decided he liked whiskey more than wages." Elias set the axe down and offered his hand. "There's a spare cot in the barn. You can stay a few nights. Do some chores if you're able." Tom nodded once. "I can pull weight." Rowena stepped out onto the porch, wiping her palms with a rag. Her eyes flicked over the stranger, gauging him without a word. Tom tipped his hat but said nothing to her. Elias didn't miss the glance. By supper, Tom had cleaned the trough and hauled 2 buckets from the spring. He ate slow, careful not to ask questions. Rowena passed him the bread without looking his way. The silence between them wasn't tense exactly, but it held something unspoken. Later, as they washed the dishes in the basin behind the cabin, Elias handed Rowena a cloth and asked, "You know him?" She shook her head. "Only his kind." "What kind's that?" "The kind that watches doors more than sunrises." Elias dried his hands and stepped closer. "You worried?" "No." She glanced back toward the barn, "just paying attention." Elias nodded once. That was enough. The next morning, Elias saddled Ember and rode north to barter for winter feed. Rowena stayed behind, chopping carrots for stew and listening to the creak of the barn roof. Around midday, Tom wandered to the porch, his limp more pronounced. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice quieter than the day before. Rowena didn't answer right away, then she nodded toward the edge of the porch. "That rail holds." Tom sat, stretching his boot out stiffly. "You ever live near the Platte River? I met a girl once in Julesburg who looked like you. She ran a dry goods shop with her brother." "I've never been east of Cheyenne," he nodded. "Figured not." "You've got the look of someone who stays where she plants." Rowena set the knife down and turned toward him. "You fishing for something or just bored?" Tom held up both hands. "Nothing like that. You don't owe me a word. Just thought maybe you'd want a story." "I've heard enough stories to last 2 lifetimes." She picked up the knife again. "But if you've got truth, I'll listen." Tom was quiet a long time. Then he said, "I started lying when I was 14. Thought it'd get me somewhere faster. Turns out it only takes you in circles." Rowena didn't look up. "Then stop walking in them." That night, Elias returned with canvas sacks slung over Ember's flank, his coat lined with dust and his mouth set in a firm line. "Snow's already touched the high ridge," he said as he unhitched the girth strap. "We've got maybe 3 weeks before the ground hardens." Rowena handed him a biscuit wrapped in cloth. "I'll start canning tomorrow." Elias looked toward the barn. "Tom, stay out of your way." He's worn thin. "But he's not looking for trouble," Elias nodded. "Then he can sleep here another night. After that, he rides on." They didn't speak of it again. 3 days later, Tom saddled his mule and accepted a small sack of flour without protest. "You're good folks," he said, glancing between them. "Real good." Rowena didn't answer, but she watched him ride out until he disappeared behind the rise. Then she turned and went back to the root cellar, her steps even, her shoulders square. That evening, Elias sat on the porch, sharpening his blade. The air was crisp now, the kind that carried sound far. Rowena brought out a jar of plum preserves and 2 tin cups of brewed chicory. "You ever think about building a smokehouse?" she asked, settling beside him. He looked up, surprised. "Hadn't yet. We've got enough meat this year to cure. Would last us through February." He studied her face, the calm surety in her voice. "You planning on February then?" Rowena didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I am." Elias set the blade down. "I want to build you something more than walls and firewood." She turned to him, her eyes steady. "Then build it with me, not for me." He reached for her hand, not with urgency but with quiet certainty. She let her fingers rest in his, neither of them needing to speak. And while the wind moved through the branches overhead, they sat side by side. 2 people no longer running, no longer bracing for the next storm, but beginning something slow and rooted. The kind of beginning that only comes after every ending has been survived. The first frost came quiet, just a silver film across the field rose and the pump handle, brittle under sunlight by mid-morning. Elias stood at the edge of the pasture, watching his breath rise in soft clouds, hands deep in his coat pockets. Rowena came up beside him, her shawl wrapped tight, eyes trained on the sky where geese passed low, wings dark against the pale blue. "They're moving early," she said. Elias nodded. "Might be a hard winter." She looked down toward the root cellar. "We'll be ready." They didn't speak more than that, but something settled between them like a vow. After breakfast, they worked side by side, clearing the last of the potatoes, their knees stained with cold earth. He handed her the sack when it got too heavy, and she didn't argue. That evening, Rowena unfolded a letter on the table, the paper creased and weathered, the ink faded but legible. She hadn't opened it since arriving. Elias had seen it tucked deep in her satchel once, but said nothing. "My mother wrote this after I left," she said quietly, holding it in both hands. "Before she passed." Elias watched her face, the way her jaw stayed still even as her fingers trembled. "You want to read it aloud?" She shook her head. "Not yet. I just needed to know it was still real." Elias reached across the table and laid his hand beside hers. "You don't owe me the past, Rowena, but if you ever want to share it, I'm here." She looked up then, and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but opening. "I was the second daughter," she said. "My sister married a banker from Salt Lake, straight-laced, full of rules. She used to say I was reckless, that I'd never make a proper wife. My mother kept peace between us, but after I left, she couldn't anymore." Elias didn't interrupt. "She must have known they wouldn't let me come back. That's why she wrote it. Not to forgive me, just to say goodbye." The words hung there. Then Rowena folded the letter again and placed it gently in the drawer beside the stove. "I mourned her already," she added, quieter. "But sometimes when I wake up here, I forget she's gone." "Just for a breath." Elias stood and crossed to her. He didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could lean if she wanted. After a long moment, she did. "Tomorrow," she said into his shirt, "I want to try making soap." "We've got enough lye, and I found a pot that'll do." He nodded against her hair. "I'll dig a fire pit." The next day brought pale sun and a stillness that felt like waiting. Elias hauled stones from the creek bed while Rowena rendered the fat he'd set aside weeks before. She worked with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her arms steady as she stirred. When the mixture thickened, she poured it into a wooden mold he'd carved the night before. They left it to set on the porch railing. That night she leaned into his side by the fire, and he rested his hand over hers without needing to speak. The soap cured over the next week. During that time, they finished sealing the windows, traded surplus eggs with a neighbor 2 miles off, and smoked the last of the venison. Rowena took to wearing Elias's second coat in the morning, the sleeves rolled once, the collar turned up against the chill. He never mentioned it, but he noticed. One evening, as they cleared brush near the fence line, Rowena paused and looked west. "There's a cemetery out near Red Rock," she said. "Where my mother's buried." Elias rested his axe against a stump. "You want to go?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "I need to, before the ground freezes," he nodded once. "We'll go Sunday, I'll ride with you." They left before dawn. The ride was quiet, the hills dusted with frost, the prairie caught between seasons. When they reached the cemetery, Rowena dismounted and walked the rows slow, her boots crunching leaves. She stopped at a small headstone, weather-worn but solid. Elias waited beside the horses. After a long while, she knelt and pressed a small bar of the soap into the earth at the base of the stone. "I made this with my own hands," she whispered, loud enough for him to hear, "and I'm still here." Her voice didn't break. She stood, brushed her palms together, and turned toward Elias. They rode home in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet one that settled deep, not heavy, just full. That night, Rowena placed another bar of soap on the shelf above the wash basin. "For us," she said. Elias stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "We're not just surviving anymore," she said. "No," he agreed. "We're building." She turned to face him. "And I love you." He didn't say it back right away. He just looked at her like she was the only thing he'd ever needed, and then he kissed her slow, like he knew there was no going back from it and didn't want to. When she pulled away, she was smiling, not with relief, not with hope, but with certainty. And Elias said, "Now she loves me." Rowena leaned into him, her forehead against his chest, and she always will. By mid-October, the ground no longer yielded easily to boot heels. The wind had picked up its winter tone, low, steady, and edged with cold. The days shortened, and the chimney burned almost from dawn to dusk. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of beeswax and cedar. Rowena had taken to keeping the windows polished, not for company, but so the light could reach farther into the room. She and Elias had fallen into rhythm, not out of routine, but out of something quieter and ease that came from knowing what the other needed without asking. Each morning he brought in wood, and she warmed the washwater. He read last year's almanac at the table while she kneaded dough, even though they both knew it was outdated. Still, the pages gave him something to hold that wasn't memory. One evening, as the fire crackled with split birch, Rowena slid a small wooden box from beneath the cot. She hadn't touched it since the first frost. Elias glanced up from his seat where he was mending the strap on a saddlebag. "I thought you'd buried that thing in the root cellar," he said gently. "I nearly did," she answered, placing it on the table. "But I couldn't make myself forget everything just to feel safe." He set the leather aside and joined her. Inside the box lay a folded map, worn soft at the creases, and a brooch shaped like a swallow in flight, cheap tin, but the kind a girl might treasure before the world taught her to expect less. She lifted it with care. "My mother gave this to me when I turned 17, she said, voice steady. "Said it was for luck. I wore it the day I left home. First thing I sold was the dress it was pinned to." She set it back in the box. "But I kept this." Elias leaned on his forearms. "You thinking of sending a letter to your sister?" Rowena shook her head. "She made it clear what she thought of me." "I'm not chasing down forgiveness that was never offered." "Then why look through all this again?" "Because it's mine," she said. "I'm not ashamed of what I lived through, not anymore, and I don't want to forget who I was before I was cast out." Elias nodded once, then reached for the map. "What's this mark here?" he asked, pointing to a faded X near the edge of the Wind River Range. "That's where I almost turned back," she said. "There's a creek there that runs like melted glass. I sat beside it for hours. Thought maybe if I stayed still long enough, someone would come looking. But no one did." She looked at him. "No one but you." He folded the map carefully and handed it back. "You ever want to go back and see that creek again, I'll ride with you." She didn't smile, but something softened in her shoulders. Someday, maybe. That night, she didn't return the box to its hiding place. Instead, she placed it on the shelf beside the ledger she used for food stores, as if it belonged among the things that mattered. The next morning brought frost so thick, it turned the pasture white. Elias saddled the mare while Rowena wrapped a scarf tight around her neck. They rode into the hills to check on a neighbor's heifers that had wandered near their northern fence. The ride was quiet but not heavy. As they reached the ridge, Elias dismounted and scanned the brush below. "They're moving slow," he said, pointing to the grazing cattle. "They'll settle if we guide him back before dusk." Rowena nodded and swung down from Ember. Her boots sank slightly in the thawing soil. "I'll circle wide," she said, already moving. Elias watched her go, sure-footed and sure-minded, and something inside him settled further. Not because she was strong, he'd known that months ago, but because she no longer needed to prove it. They herded the cattle without trouble, Elias whistling low, Rowena riding just ahead. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the animals were penned and the gate secured. As they rode home, Rowena tilted her head toward the horizon. "You ever think you'd live this quiet?" "I didn't think I'd live at all," Elias replied. "Not after the war, not after everything I saw." She didn't press, just rode beside him, the horse's breath rising in twin clouds. Back at the cabin, after the animals were fed and the lanterns lit, Elias pulled something from beneath the floorboard, a small, carved figure of a horse, smoothed from years of handling. He placed it in Rowena's palm. "My brother made this," he said, "before he went east. Said it was for luck. He's still alive." Elias shook his head. "Rode into a fever town near the Mississippi. Last letter said he was headed for Memphis. That was 8 years ago." Rowena ran her thumb over the carving's worn edges. "You kept this all that time?" "It reminded me someone believed I'd make it." She handed it back. Elias didn't take it. "I want you to have it." She looked up sharply. "Elias, you made me believe again. That counts for something." She closed her fingers around the figure and nodded once. When they lay down that night, she reached for his hand beneath the quilts. No words, just warmth. Outside, the wind rose, shaking the last leaves from the trees. Inside, the fire burned low, steady and quiet, like everything they were building, one breath, one promise, one silent truth at a time. The snow came in early November, soft at first, then heavy enough to press the roof timbers and hush the world. Elias reinforced the rafters with spare beams while Rowena stitched new lining into their coats, using wool from the bundle traded weeks earlier. They moved through the days with quiet purpose, each task done with care, not haste. In the evenings, they read aloud from the tattered book of poems Elias had found 2 winters ago, taking turns by the firelight, their voices low and even. One day, after a morning spent clearing snow from the barn eaves, Elias returned to find Rowena standing in the doorway, rubbing her wrist. He set down his gloves. "You hurt it?" "No," she said, opening and closing her hand. "Just stiff, it's from writing." "I've started keeping a record," he raised an eyebrow, "of what we've put away, what we've built," she said. "And what I've learned since I came here." He stepped closer. "You writing it for yourself?" "I think so," she said, "but maybe someday for someone else. Something to leave behind that isn't just land and tools." Elias watched her, the way she stood braced against the cold, eyes clear with purpose. "That matters," he said. "What we leave." She looked at him then, and her voice softened. "I thought I'd only ever be what was done to me. But this place, it changed that." He reached for her hand, the one she'd been flexing. "You did that yourself," he said. "I only cleared the space." The days shortened further, and the silence of winter pressed in. They began rising before first light, moving through chores with lanterns hung on nails by the door. Rowena took over the coop, and Elias spent afternoons crafting a new gate for the east side of the corral. One morning, she brought him a scrap of paper from her ledger. "Thought we might mark the days," she said, handing him a list of dates and plans. "If we follow this, we'll be ready for spring planting by April." He studied it, then looked up. "You thinking that far ahead now?" "I want to," she said. "I want to see what comes next." That night they lay side by side on the cot, the quilts heavy over them, the fire crackling low. Rowena traced the lines of Elias's palm with her fingertip. "You ever think about building a bigger house?" she asked. He shifted, settling closer. "Sometimes. I'd like a room with a window that faces east," she said, "so I can see the sun early as it comes." He nodded. "What else?" "A table with 4 chairs," she murmured, "even if it's just us. And a shelf for all the things we didn't have before." Elias reached for her hand beneath the covers. "We'll build it," he said, "every piece." In December, the snow deepened. A fox den appeared near the south tree line, and Rowena watched the tracks each morning, learning their pattern. Elias began carving a cradle from maple he'd stored the year before, though he said nothing of its purpose. He did it slow, with care, the way he did most things. One evening, Rowena came in from the woodshed with her cheeks pink and eyes shining. She set her gloves aside and crossed the room in 3 steps. "I'm with child," she said without hesitation. Elias turned from the hearth. "You're sure?" She nodded once. "I've known near a fortnight." I waited to be certain. He stepped toward her, then stopped, as if afraid to break the stillness. "Is that something you want?" "I do," she said. "With you, I do." He let out a breath, slow and quiet, then reached for her. She wrapped her arms around him, and they stood there a long while, pressed close, the cold locked outside. That night he brought the carved cradle inside and laid it near the hearth. She saw it and said nothing, just placed her hand over his on the wood. By late winter, the days began to stretch again. The snow receded from the edges of the cabin, revealing patches of brown earth and the first stubborn crocus breaking through. Rowena moved slower now, careful in her steps, but still kept pace with the work. Elias spent more time by her side. He repaired the chimney stone by stone, replaced the door hinges, and built the frame for the east-facing window she'd asked for. Each evening, when the light faded, they sat near the fire, her head resting where his heart beat steady. One morning in March, she woke him before dawn. Her voice was even, but her grip on his arm was tight. "It's time," she said. They had made preparations. A neighbor's wife, Sarah, rode in by midday, and by nightfall, Rowena's cries gave way to a quiet, fierce, sobbing, the sound of relief, not sorrow. Elias stood outside the door the entire time, hands clenched, heart hammering, until Sarah stepped out with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "She's strong," she said. "So's the boy." Elias stepped inside. Rowena lay propped on the cot, pale with exhaustion, her hair damp but her gaze steady. In her arms, swaddled in a worn linen blanket, slept a red-faced child with a shock of dark hair. Elias knelt beside her and touched the baby's hand. "He's real," he whispered. Rowena smiled, tired but full. "He's ours." He kissed her, then slow, reverent, with more gratitude than words could hold. Spring came in full, and with it the planting. They took turns with the baby, passing him between them like something sacred. Rowena finished her ledger and began a new one, this time labeled for him. Elias finished the east window and built the table with 4 chairs, just as she'd asked. They named the boy Caleb, after a man Elias had known long ago who'd once said that peace was earned, not found. And peace was what they had. Not in grand gestures or quiet perfection, but in each morning they woke to the sound of wind through pine, in the way their hands moved together over soil, in the way Rowena laughed when Caleb grabbed Elias's beard, and in the stillness of nights spent with firelight dancing on their faces. They had built a life from what was broken, and it held.